Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to Ms. Cassandra Ramdath's dissertation defense. I'm Hong An Song, chair of the dissertation committee. We're here today to learn about Cassandra's research on the consequences of traumatic brain injury among juvenile offenders. And a few of us are here to evaluate her work. Let me first introduce the dissertation committee. The other two members of the committee are Dr. Homer Venters from New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, who was instrumental in assisting Cassandra to gain access to the sample, and Dr. Jeff Mello, who provided valuable guidance in health policy matters. Cassandra has spent a lot of time talking to her subjects to learn about their experiences, and I'm sure that she has some important or interesting findings to share with us today. The rundown of the meeting will be as follows. First, Cassandra will give a 40-minute presentation. Then committee members will start asking questions, and that's a critical part of this oral examination. Afterwards, the floor will be open to the audience so that everybody can ask questions, make comments, and have a chance to interact with Cassandra. And finally, we'll invite Cassandra and the audience to step out of the room so that the committee can have a closed-door meeting and decide on the outcome of the examination. That's it. That's your time.
Chill. This is right. Can we do? Yeah, that's fine. Insert the timer. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming today to hear me talk about the work that I did on traumatic brain injuries among adolescents who are in the New York City jail system. So to begin, I'll talk to you about the problem of TBI in the criminal justice system. I'll give you an overview of the study as well as the contextual, theoretical, and empirical framework that I used for my study. I'll talk to you a little bit about the study setting, its design, and the methods that were used. I'll present the results, first the quantitative and then the qualitative results, and then in the discussion, I'll bring them together. I'll talk about future research, limitations of the study, and policy implications before opening up for questions. So traumatic brain injury is when there's a sudden impact to your head, and it can cause brain damage and cognitive impairments. These cognitive impairments can be things like difficulty thinking, difficulty with emotions, difficulty with information processing, and things like that. This is particularly important among younger populations because their brains are still in the formative years up until mid-20s. So when you have head injuries at young ages, you can develop chronic or long-term cognitive impairments. In some cases, it can lead people to criminal justice involvement. Not very many studies have been done on this topic, but the small numbers of studies have shown that there's a higher prevalence of TBI among incarcerated populations than in the general population. So I think that there's a need to consider TBI in best practices for correctional management and for reentry planning. So the current study set out to investigate TBI-related neurological anomalies and custodial and reentry challenges. The goals were to establish the prevalence of TBI in this sample, to characterize TBI, and to examine and characterize the association between TBI and custodial challenges and reentry challenges. These goals were achieved through two main objectives. One was a quantitative analysis and one was a qualitative analysis. The significance of this study was that it's the second ever study on TBI in New York City jails using a mixed method, and the third one examining TBI overall. Traumatic brain injuries are usually associated with three symptoms. So first, there's a coma, which is the ability for you to respond to external stimuli. Alteration of consciousness could mean that you've lost consciousness or that you've become confused confused or dazed for a period of time, and post-traumatic amnesia, which is a loss of memory associated with the event. Together, these symptoms are used to classify the severity of injuries as mild, moderate, or severe. Severe TBIs are obviously the most serious. They usually involve some form of a coma. Mild TBIs are frequently known as concussions. So this is the most common form of TBI, and also some research suggests that multiple concussions over your life can have a cumulative effect and be almost as bad as a moderate or severe TBI. These injuries are usually considered to be open or closed. So I'll explain. Open are usually from a penetrating source. So something might penetrate your skull, might penetrate your brain. This could be something like a gunshot or a stabbing. Closed head injuries come from various different forms, but essentially all this means is that there was no opening, the brain injury happened within your skull. So some kind of a force caused your brain to bounce around inside of your skull and lead to brain damage. An example of this would be airbag trauma. To understand how these injuries can lead to behavioral consequences, it's kind of helpful to understand the very basic physiology of these injuries. I'll explain it very briefly. So your brain is made up of cortices, which are neural tissues, and primary injuries are structural. So they will cause deformation in your brain. These are easily detected in MRIs or brain imaging techniques. So this can mean that you have a skull fracture, it can mean that your brain swells, but it's easily detectable. Secondary injuries are a little bit more difficult because they're neural in nature, which means that you can think of your brain as like a neural circuit. They're made up of neurons and neural pathways, which together are responsible for perceiving information, processing it, and responding. And so with these types of injuries, the neurons sometimes can die and the connectivity between the pathways can be disrupted. But currently with the technology that we have, you can't actually see this in imaging, but we do know that there's diminished brain activity, which you can see later on when there's developmental delays and behavioral challenges as a result. One important thing to consider is stress in the brain, especially given this population or this sample that I'm looking at. Neural pathways develop early in life, so being surrounded by stress and trauma and violence can strengthen neural pathways that cause people to see the world as a hostile place. So exposure to ongoing trauma strengthen these pathways and make them more easily activated with time. In addition, stress can cause structural damage through the release of cortisol, and this can damage parts of the brain related to emotional regulation, memory, and impulse control. So the theoretical framework that I used for this study was biosocial criminology and neurocriminology. Under biosocial criminology, the idea is that behavior is derived from an interaction between an individual's makeup and their environmental factors. So for example, behavior originates in the brain. Your brain is in part made up of your genetic composition, so your genetic makeup, and it's also shaped through life based on your environmental experiences. So for example, the third point, everyone's sitting in this exact same room, listening to the exact same presentation, but having differential responses. In part, this is partially genetic, partially because of the experiences that you've had in your life that have shaped your perception. So under biosocial criminology, I'm specifically focusing on neurocriminology, which uses neuroscience techniques to examine behavior. It puts forth that brain injuries can inhibit neurodevelopment and lead to potentially lead to criminal justice involvement. And one thing to note about neurocriminology is that it promotes pro-social neurological development. The idea is that your brain is malleable, so it's always developing, these neural pathways are always developing. And this is helpful to know because we can create healthy environments that will strengthen neural connections and encourage and promote pro-social behaviors. I have to know the theoretical challenges with looking at biological influences on criminality. In the past, we've seen how looking at biological characteristics have led to harmful policies such as racial and ethnic segregation, the eugenics and the Holocaust and so forth. So we have to be careful to avoid determinism and prediction and trying to predict levels of dangerousness or violence or anything like that. But what's important is that behavior is a product of both biological and social influences, and we have to find safe ways to factor both of these influences in. So my study, so the research that has been done on TBI and criminal justice isn't really vast, but what has been found is that there's a higher prevalence of TBI in correctional settings, which suggests that many inmates might be suffering from cognitive impairments. And some of these things are delayed information processing, emotional dysregulation, difficulty with reasoning and judgment, and difficulty with impulse control. So if you can imagine, having these types of problems when placed in the adverse nature of a jail could lead to unique custodial challenges. My study was set in Rikers Island, which is part of the New York City jail system. The New York City jail system is quite big. It has about 12 to 14,000 inmates. And a lot of these jails have people who are detainees, which means that they are waiting to go to trial, so they haven't been convicted or sentenced yet. I specifically focused on Rikers Island. So for those of you who are familiar with New York City, it's literally an island. The only way to get there is through that Rikers Island Bridge, which connects to Queens. And when you get there, there's this big island of 10 jail complexes. And among those 10 complexes, I focused on RNDC, which is where they house the adolescents. Again, important to note, New York and North Carolina are the only two states that treat 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. Everywhere else, they're still treated as juveniles. So when you think about it, we have about 400 to 800 adolescents, so very young people in jail and often spending quite a bit of time there. That's important because, as many of us already know, there has been this ongoing culture of violence in Rikers Island. Some of you may know, but in August or October, sometime at the end of 2014, DOJ released this report saying that there was a deep-seated culture of violence in Rikers Island. They sued DOC for deliberate indifference to inmates' constitutional rights, basically because, especially with the adolescents, they were getting beat up a lot. There was excessive use of force by the corrections officers and the inmates on an ongoing basis. So this led to reforms that have been trying to be put in place. One example is elimination of punitive segregation for 16 and 17-year-olds. Hasn't yet happened for 18-year-olds, but is in progress. This study set out to answer 3 broad research questions. So I wanted to know if TBI was more common in this population compared to in the community. I wanted to know if those who were suffering with TBI experienced unique custodial challenges and unique reentry challenges. To answer these questions, I used a mixed method study with a quantitative component on 262 inmates and a qualitative component with 20 inmates. I'll talk to you first about my quantitative component. The questions and the hypotheses that I had were basically suggesting that there would be a higher prevalence of TBI in the sample, that the inmates who had TBI would experience more fights and injuries, more time in punitive segregation, they would recidivate more quickly and more frequently. To answer these questions, I obtained data from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene on 262 male adolescents who were screened for TBI. I created my TBI variable as people who had head injuries prior to coming into Rikers, so this was in the community, and head injuries that resulted in alteration of consciousness. So they blacked out or they had post-traumatic amnesia. My dependent variables were whether or not someone had an injury while in Rikers, whether or not someone was in punitive segregation, whether or not someone recidivated, and how long it took them to do so if they did. So my first table shows my descriptives of the sample. What you can see is that the average age of the sample was 17, which makes sense. There wasn't very much range to begin with. Most of the sample was Black, had some high school education. Mental health services, so 42% had access to mental health services while in Rikers. So it's important to note that this is not a mental health diagnosis. It's just that they access services for mental health related issues in Rikers at least 3 times because they self-identified the need or a correctional staff referred them. 40% reported using marijuana when they came into the facility. I didn't look at anything other than marijuana because it was so small, it was like 3%. On average, they had come into Rikers already, in and out of Rikers about 3 times. And the average length of stay over their life, so this is a cumulative number, was 105 days. So they had spent about 3.5 months in Rikers throughout their life. When I looked at my descriptors for TBI, I found that 50% of the sample had a TBI with at least one alteration of consciousness. On average, the age of first incident was 12, and at the time, the average total lifetime incidences was approximately 4. Most of these injuries were from fighting, from sports, and from falls, which is different from in a comparable sample in the community. The head injuries in a similar sample are actually more often from sports and vehicle accidents. Okay, so I ran my descriptives for the outcome variables, and I found that 52% of them had at least one custodial injury, 26% had been placed in punitive segregation at least once, 62% had recidivated at least once, again, in and out about 3 times. And the average number of days to first recidivism was 144 days. So it took them about 4.5 months before they came back to Rikers the first time. So I ran some bivariate analyses to look at the difference between the TBI inmates and the non-TBI inmates. And so obviously this is a really overwhelming table, so I'll just highlight what I found, which was that those who had TBI were almost 2 times more likely to access mental health services while they were in Rikers. That was the only statistically significant finding for this analysis. I did bivariate result analyses for my outcomes as well, and the only one that had a significant relationship was punitive segregation. So those who had TBI were almost 2 times more likely to be placed in punitive segregation. Of course, that's not controlling for all the other variables, so I ran multivariate analyses as well, and I found that, I kind of color-coded it, I'll explain it. What I found was that TBI in the red was not a significant predictor of whether or not someone had a custodial injury. Mental health service utilization, marijuana, criminal history, these increased the odds of somebody having a custodial injury, and age decreased the odds of someone having a custodial injury. For punitive segregation, again, TBI was not a significant predictor of a TBI. If someone accessed mental health services, they were actually 7 times more likely to have been placed in punitive segregation. For recidivism, the first way I looked at it was whether or not someone recidivated. TBI was not a significant predictor of whether or not someone recidivated, but mental health services increased the odds, and education and marijuana decreased the odds. I was also interested in seeing if we could figure out what was making people come back either in a shorter or longer period of time. So I ran a survival cost regression analysis and found that TBI, which was still not a predictor, it was basically the same thing. So education and marijuana lengthened the amount of time it took someone to come back, but mental health services decreased the amount of time. So from these findings, from my analyses, TBI was not a significant predictor in any of the outcomes that I had, I didn't get into this because of time, but if you really look at the tables and the results, you'll see that the substantive results are going in the direction that I expected them to go, but they just didn't reach the level of statistical significance. So maybe a bigger N or better measures of some of these variables might improve the model. Also, what I found was that mental health was related to almost all of the outcomes. So I did structural equational modeling to look at the indirect effect. What I found was that TBI has an indirect effect on the outcomes through mental health. So it suggests that at least some of the inmates with TBI are demonstrating behaviors that are consistent with mental health outcomes that are leading to some of the outcomes in this study. What's important to kind of take away from this is that brain injuries are not the same as mental illness, but it's possible that people with brain injuries are getting diagnosed with mental illness or are developing mental illness, but we need to do further research to kind of disentangle this. So a summary of the quantitative findings basically showed me that there was a higher prevalence of TBI in this sample when comparing them to a comparable sample in the community. TBI was not a significant predictor of custodial fights and injuries, of punitive segregation, and of recidivism. However, the substantive results were mostly in the expected direction, and there is an indirect effect between TBI and the outcomes through mental health. So I'll tell you about my qualitative component now, which was basically a set of interviews where I talked to inmates about their custodial arguments, fights, and injuries, punitive segregation, their release into the community, and I screened them for TBIs and I asked them about the circumstances that led to these head injuries. I talked to 20 adolescents. I used purposive quota sampling so that I could speak to 10 inmates with TBI and 10 inmates without TBI to compare their responses. The way that it worked was I had an escort officer in Rikers Island who worked with me to bring potential participants in a separate room. It was just me and the inmate. It was private, confidential. I told them about the study, obtained assent if they wanted to participate, and I explained to them that I would be depositing $10 into their commissary, which is kind of like a jail bank account, after the interview. I initiated a 60 to 90 minute semi-structured interview, which included the TBI screening, and I analyzed the interviews by creating 5 substantive categories. I used open coding to connect patterns and develop overarching themes, and I have some quotes that will highlight what I found. The first category that I created was about TBI. What I found was that 40% of the 40% of the people I talked to had an injury that led to an alteration of consciousness from fighting. 60% had a blow to the front or the back of their head, which is important for frontal lobe functioning, which is responsible for reasoning and higher level thinking. 70% involved the loss of consciousness for less than an hour, and 70% got treatment, usually from going through the emergency room. So I asked them questions about their head injuries and to tell me how they were happening. What they told me were things like, I was just having a fight with a bunch of people. I got hit with a metal cane on my head and I got 6 stitches. I blacked out and woke up in the hospital. The fight was in the street because of beef. They didn't like me and I didn't like them. I was 14. Another one told me, I got jumped. They cut me on my face and on my head. I blacked out and woke up in an ambulance after 5 minutes. I didn't know what happened at first, but it came back to me. I was 17. So they kind of talked about it as no big deal. This is just what happens, a sense of normalcy. The second category was participant characteristics. So I tried to look at the difference between the TBI participants and non-TBI. Those who had TBI were more frequently coming from the Bronx, living with someone other than a mother or a father, so living with a girlfriend or a cousin or a friend. And on average, they were 1 grade lower, so they had completed 9th grade on average, whereas the non-TBI groups had at least completed 10th grade. The TBI participants also consumed alcohol and marijuana more heavily. They had fewer diagnoses of mental illness, but the few diagnoses that they did have were for more severe forms of mental illness like bipolar or depression. They were also less involved in the juvenile justice system, but more involved in the adult system. They'd come in Rikers a lot more, but remember this is self-report, so they may not necessarily have remembered all the interactions that they've had. So I asked them about things like why they weren't going to school, and they told me that I stopped going to school. I started selling weed, drugs, and shooting guns. I spent time drinking. We sat on the corner and sold weed. I smoked, tried to get girls, and went to parties. Someone else told me, I haven't been in school since I was 15. I was going to class, but I wasn't doing the work. I started doing stuff that I wasn't supposed to be doing because there's no money in going to school. So the third category that I created was about the arguments, fights, and injuries. What I found was, first of all, everybody was fighting. In TBI, non-TBI, everybody was fighting with each other. But with the TBI participants, they were having fewer verbal but more physical arguments with the corrections officers, suggesting that maybe their altercations were escalating quicker than the non-TBI participants. They were also involved in more fights that were related to gangs and that involved weapons in the facility. And they also, I guess it follows that they had more injuries from being stabbed or being sliced, whereas the non-TBI participants talk more about their injuries as being a small injury, so having a busted lip or a broken nose, which they said was small. One thing that really came out of this part of the interview was the idea of holding it down. So inmates often had to hold it down, which means you don't tell people about fights, you don't tell them about the injuries you're having, you keep everything quiet. If a CO sees it, either they well, a CO is a correction officer. If they see it, they don't have to tell, they don't have to intervene, which is symbolizing sort of permission to fight. So this is leading to an established presence of violence in Rikers Island. The inmates are extorting each other, they're bullying each other, they're stealing each other's food, and they're doing this through an ongoing threat of violence that never really gets reported or documented. So I asked them to talk to me about their fights. They said things like, I got into a fight with the captain because I didn't want to be strip searched. I stole something and it would have fell. The captain was like, you're not going to strip? I was like, no. He slapped me and I punched him. I broke his nose. A group of corrections officers jumped me. Another one said, I cut an inmate's face because they were threatening me. I was a blood gang. He was in a blood household and I'm not blood. I jumped an inmate and I cut his face so I could get out of there. The COs are retarded for placing me in a house where they know I will get beat up. They put me here again, so now I'm going to get jumped unless I fight or cut someone else. So again, the sort of necessity to fight in some cases. And then here, exemplifying holding it down. COs are supposed to stop fights, but some are like, if you want to fight, just go in the corner and separate in 5 minutes. Don't do nothing to get infracted on my tour. Sometimes this was because they didn't want to write up the paperwork. And another one said, I planned to fight in the shower with another inmate. We had a lookout who shouted, hot nine, warning that the CO was coming. When the CO came, we acted like we were playing around. Whoever loses has to hold it down. So you don't say anything. If you have an injury, you clean it up yourself, you deal with it, and no one knows about it. Some COs know that they can't prove it because we made sure that they don't see it. The fourth category was punitive segregation. What I found here was interesting. The TBI participants were more frequently in punitive segregation, but also for longer periods of time. The average was 138 days compared to 68 among the non-TBI participants. This means that they had prolonged exposure to some of the conditions of punitive segregation, which they talked to me about as being deprived of food. The corrections officers wouldn't always give them food if they didn't like them or if they did something to make them angry. They would give them less food sometimes, they would portion their foods, or they would pretend to give them their food so it's caught on camera, but they wouldn't really do it. And they lacked privileges, they lived in unsanitary conditions. And so I think more of them seem to be struggling because they told me that they found it difficult, and more TBI participants committed acts of suicide attempts or self-harm. So these are kind of the stories that they were telling me about punitive segregation. One said, it was hell, the worst thing was the mice. They ran in and out of my cells and I used to scream. People always screamed about roaches, mice, and water bugs. Another said, I tried to hang it up, which means try to commit suicide. I tried to hang it up like 7 times. I took the sheets off the bed, tied it up to the lights, made a hole, and put my head through it. It takes 1 minute and 20 seconds to get dizzy and 3 minutes to drop. But you have to do it when the CO is looking, so they'll take you out. But all the times I tried hanging it up didn't work. Sometimes they were like, oh, you're playing, and I had to take myself down. Then I let go for real, and I was hanging. I was choking to death. I had to try my luck because they weren't paying attention to the fake one. When I did it for real, they got me up out of there. And the last one said, I was doing crazy stuff. I tried to hang it up, and then they put me in a mental observation room alone. I scratched the wood off a chair, and I tried to cut myself. It didn't work, so I took my teeth, and I bit through my wrist, and I took a piece of a comb, and I stuck it in there. They had to surgically remove it. So these quotes really are very powerful in exemplifying the things that they're dealing with in punitive segregation and how hard they're trying to get out, to the points where they're committing very extreme acts to try to be removed from this environment. The last category was about what they thought about going back into the community. Most of them said that they were going to move out of the neighborhood because they were worried about negative peer associations and the ability for them to stay away from the violence and stay off the streets. They really believed that nothing in the community could help them no matter what, but that they had some form of support at home. It seemed as though they were less excited about their release, possibly because they were facing some, I think like 3 or 4 of them were facing quite a bit of time. So one of them told me, it's so far away, so it's hard to think about. I'm facing 8 years upstate. I'm 18 years old, and when I get out, I'll be 26. So here you see a very young kid is going to face a lot of time, and he just really can't imagine his life outside of the So a summary of my findings from the qualitative components show that inmates talked about their head injuries as normal and necessary. You got these head injuries because violence is normal. There's no other way to really deal with conflict. And you have to fight, otherwise you won't survive. In regards to custodial fights and injuries, it seems that the arguments are quickly escalating when it comes to the corrections officers, potentially related to delayed information processing, if that's what they're struggling with, and impulse control. So these altercations escalate further. They're also involved in more slashings and stabbings. Punitive segregation, they again had more and longer exposure, and I just want to point out that a lot of times people who are in punitive segregation for longer are because they're having issues or altercations with corrections officers, or because they're having weapons-related fights. So it seems kind of obvious that they are in punitive segregation longer because of those other issues that came up earlier. And for reentry, again, they were really concerned about what their life would be like when they come back to this community of violence, and they really didn't think that anything in the community could help them. So in bringing the results together, I created 5 themes that I thought were kind of big picture things, showing how TBI participants might be exposed to an additional set of challenges through these 5 themes. So one was violence as a norm. I think that for them, whether they're in the facility or in the community, violence is just the way of life. There's no way around it. It's what they have to do. I remember having one inmate tell me, where can you walk around in New York City without having to watch your back? They really live in this life where violence is an ongoing thing. The threat of violence is very, very real. Survival by all means. So as you can see by the quotes and what I said, they were doing anything and everything to try to somehow adapt to the environments that they were placed in, to the points of suicide, to the points of making weapons, very creative ways that they used to make weapons in the facility. But just to survive, because they always had to do something to adapt to whatever situation they were placed in. A life of ongoing trauma. So on top of the violence, I felt like they were exposed to lots of psychological and emotional trauma throughout their life, again related to thinking about how this is impacting the development of their brain as young kids. And there was no point in time where they kind of had a break from all these traumatic experiences. Deprivation and shame as punishment. They talked a lot about being deprived of things such as food. Shame. So when you're in punitive segregation, if you want to go to rec, you can go, but you're still placed in a cage, kind of like in a zoo-like fashion, I think. You're also shackled. So these experiences are also embarrassing, and a lot of inmates won't do it. And I think that type of embarrassment for younger populations can lead to a depletion of self-worth and impact their self-esteem and self-confidence, which also is going to have other related impacts. And the last thing was hopelessness. I think that all of these together, the fact that there's no way out of violence, even in the facilities, authorities are not stopping it. In fact, they're encouraging it. They're always trying to survive. They live in this survival of the fittest mode. They're never breaking out of this cycle of trauma, and they're always being deprived and shamed of things. And all of this is leading to a sense of hopelessness. I think that they don't trust people in the community. They don't trust people in the system. They probably don't even trust themselves or really feel very great about themselves by the end of all of this. And then we release them into the community and expect them to somehow survive again. So the broad questions of this study, basically using the quantitative and the qualitative components, what I found, essentially there was a higher prevalence of TBI in this population when compared to a similar sample in the community. Most of these injuries were from community violence, and this violence was unavoidable. They had no choice in the areas that they were coming from, and in Rikers Island, they couldn't do anything about it. In terms of custodial challenges, the quantitative analyses were inconclusive, but the interviews suggest that they are experiencing some fights differently, and that they're involved in things that are leading them to punitive segregation for more time and being exposed to these conditions that lead them to self-harm and self-injury. Again, quantitative analyses were inconclusive, but the interviews definitely suggest that they're worried. They're worried about having to go back into these communities where there's violence, and they don't really think that there's anything there that's going to help them. Other findings that came out, not necessarily related to the research questions, is, as we like to say, no finding is a finding. Even though there were inconclusive findings in the quantitative analyses, again, the substantive results were in the expected direction. So I think with bigger samples, maybe we could better highlight this. But even more important, what we know now from the interviews is that the data is not going to accurately reflect the injuries and the fights that are happening because they're not getting reported and they're not getting documented. So they're not going to come out in the data. Also, one other thing is that this is also leading, is kind of preserving the culture of violence because there's a lack of accountability in Rikers. So future research should, I think, further disaggregate environmental and physiological influences. So maybe consider some more community level characteristics in a multi-level modeling analysis. I think that we could also better distinguish the consequences of TBI from mental illness. Again, brain injuries are not the same as mental illness, although there might be some overlap. So we need to think about how to respond to them because the treatment for TBIs are usually more successful when they're social rather than medical. So we have to think about what that means. And I think, again, larger studies usually using more reliable measures. I really think that mixed methods is still a really good approach for when you're studying something like this where you know there's secrecy involved. Because doing the data analysis, if I stopped there, I probably would have just said there's no findings at all. Limitations of this study. So of course, keeping in mind this is Rikers Island, it's a unique sample. What you find in Rikers Island may not be generalizable to another jail, maybe in Texas or something, I don't know. And I relied on self-report. So this was based on the answers that they were giving. They may not have remembered things. We're asking them to recall things about an injury that in itself might have caused a memory problem. So also they may have not wanted to answer things, or they may have answered in a way they thought I wanted them to answer. Methodologically, of course, the validity of the data, again, I don't think it accurately captured what was really happening in Rikers in the quantitative component. And in the qualitative component, I think there was some stuff there, but it is a small sample size. I only interviewed 20 inmates, and sometimes the differences were between 3 and 4 inmates, but I think the emerging themes warrant further exploration. And from the study, what I think is that we should start educating and training correctional staff and inmates about TBI. So how to identify TBI, what the consequences are, and the importance of seeking out immediate treatment, especially for these inmates who are going to be released back into these communities of violence where it's probably likely that they're going to have more injuries, unfortunately. We have to think about what that means for education and awareness. Screenings and assessments in Rikers Island, we should start screening and doing cognitive functional assessments. I think that this would, if we did cognitive functional assessments with inmates when they came in, we could better understand if they have cognitive impairments, and if that means maybe they can't follow instructions as well as some of the other people. And what does that mean for treatment? What does that mean for their management while they're in there? This can also be used for reentry planning when someone is leaving the facility. If you do assessments and better understand their cognitive functioning for when they are leaving and understanding how they're going to navigate their community, what resources they might need, that might be important as well. I do want to point out that we have to be cautious of net widening. We don't want to just start flagging people for TBI and supervising them more and saying they have to do certain services. I think it should be a voluntary and person-centered approach. They should really understand and want to have this treatment or services. In the community, I think there could also be awareness, especially in communities of high violence. So doctors, physicians, nurses, teachers, people who have the ability to maybe identify that there's something happening here and that someone might need some help. Judges in the juvenile justice system, if they're trained to identify TBI, they could probably have more of a preventive approach. Social workers, mental health workers, and so forth. Overall, in the general community, I think that increasing awareness could maybe have a preventive effect. So the CDC actually has this huge heads-up initiative, which they've recently been working on. They provide tons of information about head injuries, how to identify them, the importance of seeking treatment is usually what they're saying. They also have customizable concussion plans. So if you have a concussion, you can go online and get this plan for you or your friend. And They also have lots of tools for health workers, so healthcare workers, that might be helpful as well. So in conclusion, the current study examined TBI among incarcerated adolescents. The idea was that some of the cognitive impairments that they were getting from community violence were possibly leading to challenges that they were facing in the facility. Although inconclusive findings there were inconclusive findings in the qualitative component, the qualitative component suggests that they might be experiencing challenges that we need to find more valid ways to measure with bigger samples. Future studies should disaggregate individual and environmental factors as well as distinguishing TBI from mental illness. And I think that we need to focus on education for correctional staff and inmates, ongoing screening and assessment to inform treatment plans, correctional management, and reentry planning. Overall, I think an increased community awareness can also have a preventive effect. So traumatic brain injury among adolescents is an important criminal justice issue. We saw that there's a higher prevalence in this group of people, and it's important for criminal justice, it's important for public health as well. I think that further exploration is going to be essential in improving correctional health, correctional safety, and correctional management as well. So, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. Okay, now we're going to invite committee members to step in and start a conversation. Omar, do you want to start?
So fantastic data. Thank you for sharing this with us. It's very impressive. So I'll start with a couple of specific comments, questions, and then go to policy work. So one of the things I wondered about is your knowledge about comparing the prevalence in the jail system to prevalence in the community. It strikes me that in the community, people come to the attention of healthcare officers in the emergency room, whereas in the jails, every injury has to be brought to medical attention. And so, how do you kind of weigh the difference in methods of reporting with an assessment that it still would be more prevalent?
Yeah, I did think about that because I know that on the CDC website and all of their articles, they are showing that these head injuries are being notified through emergency rooms, which means they're more severe. So the mild TBIs are probably higher in the community. So that's something that I have to think more about, because if the major difference, I think, is that the source of the injuries are coming from fights versus sports and motor vehicle accidents. But I do think that the prevalence there might not be as much of a difference in the prevalence if you were screening every single person in the community. Only because what we know and what we find out is from hospitalization. So those are going to be the most severe types of head injuries.
And then I guess related to that is that, if you go to urban areas around the country or communities in urban areas where all these patients are from, these people are from, or disproportionately, you might wonder if you have a high community prevalence there. If you're getting, the closer your community gets to look like who's in jail,
Right.
maybe the higher the prevalence is, or just maybe the higher of violence related to the others. Another question I had, and this goes to both the quantitative and qualitative, is about the temporal relationship. When you were looking for TBI and its relationship, either to mental health involvement or the relationship to solitary punitive stay. Some of those TBIs occurred in jail, correct?
Well, I asked them only for when we did the screenings for the guys, it was asking them to only talk about things before they came into America. So yeah, the temporal ordering is something that I guess I should have put that in my limitation slide. I am aware of it, but we are kind of assuming that it would have happened before they came in because that's what we asked them. Although you would have to find out every single head injury, every single entrance into Rikers, every single mental health diagnosis to really do like a time ordering sequence type thing to understand that.
one of the things, I think you've seen this data, but we recently reported that people who are young and people who are of color are more likely to get there. If they come into the mental health service in the jails, it's more likely to happen late in their stay, and it's more likely to happen in the context of solitary confinement.
Mental health
That's,
socialization.
that's right. So what, that is to say that if you're a young person in our jail system, or if you're non-white, your path into mental health more likely happens later in your stay and more likely happens around the time you're in solitary, as opposed to people who come in and get picked up right away in the first few
Right.
days. So the two risk factors for being in that late group and solitary group for mental health are people of color and people who are disabled. So I'm wondering your qualitative interactions with people, and also thinking about your quantitative, like looking for the relationship between TBI and mental health. So if you knew that this group was disproportionately getting either the mental health involvement was later, or that let's say you knew that the people in your study were getting a mental health involvement late in their stay just because of solitary, how would that impact your interpretation of the results here?
I guess I would have a question first. Do they not get screened at intake for mental health?
Everybody does,
Uh,
but some people get picked up and some people don't. And so what's striking to us is, and this kind of gets to this other big area, which is that, so maybe people get missed because they're young or because they're non-white, but maybe people get missed because they don't have a problem. They get into solitary, and then they have what's basically, again, could be an adaptive response or could be a pathological response.
Yeah, that's kind of a question that I was thinking about as well, especially when they were talking about punitive segregation. It seemed like, in a weird way, that it was kind of rational what they were doing, that they were trying to get out of punitive segregation using whatever means they had available. And I wasn't sure, does it mean they have a mental illness because they did everything to try to get out, or is that what anybody would do if you're placed in those conditions? So I was kind of thinking the same thing. Are they getting mental health services because they tried to hang it up to get out, and now they're getting these services because they had a mental health issue, or because they were just trying to get out of punitive segregation? So mental health and the punitive segregation, and when they were getting services, was something that I thought about, but I think I would have to try to get the dates of mental health services received to know when was the first time, second time, third time, and if that changed for both groups. Maybe one group was able to get them faster than the other group, and I'd have to look at that using probably dates of service.
And did you review the literature or come to learn about how juvenile justice settings have approached either TBI or just, their different approach from a custody management standpoint in jails?
I came across some stuff. I can't remember now. I think it was in Texas, maybe, or somewhere where they were starting to do these safe rooms, I think, or pull down houses or something where they had the space in the facility. It's more of a therapeutic type environment where people who may have been suffering from TBIs have this safe zone where they can go and kind of calm down, which is especially important for if you have TBIs in the facility because you need to relax. So I did see that, and I think it was in Texas, but I can't actually remember 100%, where they were implementing these therapeutic approaches and safe zones for inmates to kind of go to.
I asked because I saw you had a number of recommendations, but you alluded at the beginning to the fact that New York and North Carolina are the only states that put this group of people into jails and adult jail routinely. And so I wondered, since juvenile justice settings often have this different approach, if that might not be what your thoughts were about not putting children in the adult jail system.
Well, yeah, I don't think we should put children in Rikers Island, or maybe anybody in Rikers Island, but I think that one thing that I should add into my recommendations would be implementing some of these things into the juvenile justice facilities here, and raising the age, perhaps.
And the last thing I'll commend a word to you that I learned along the way from my boss, Ramdath, rhipitamania, which is a made-up phony mental health diagnosis that was given to slaves who fled the plantation by pseudoscience mental health disorder. So the notion was that there must be something wrong with them because they couldn't handle their environmental conditions. And mental health experts came up with it. So we have this discussion about what we were just talking about, which is that when people go to hang up or cut themselves in the box, is that normal human behavior, or is there something wrong with them? Clearly there's stress there. Clearly something. So fantastic work.
Thank you. So just first off, a very strong presentation. I also thank you for answering all my comments that I sent you. It was, but that's always nice to see. So in particular, your discussion about the exposure to long-term stress. And I think, and I hope you will continue your research in this area. So going forward, you at least maybe pick your own brain about possibly a different research design. How would you go about doing a better measure of TBI? Because to me, that definitely is probably the weakest issue. And can you get data from brain imaging?
I doubt in Rikers they could do brain
Right.
imaging. In terms of better measures, one thing I thought was maybe we could have added on an assessment component to see if those with TBI, and maybe give a number of people assessments, and then looked into if people who were screened positive for TBI were having different cognitive difficulties compared to those who didn't. We kind of did it in the screening. We asked them a number of questions about, do you feel, very short, like, do you feel dizzy? Do you have headaches? Is this environment hard for you to be in? But when I did it, I found that, of course, they're going to say yes. They're in jail. They're all going to think that this environment is difficult for them, regardless of whether they had a TBI or not. So I think that maybe if we look into better assessments for understanding the challenges or cognitive impairments specifically related to TBI, we could maybe have a better measure of what challenges they're having. Brain imaging, I don't know that we could do that in Rikers. And also the challenge with that is a lot of mild TBIs don't have the structural damage that would be able to even be detected from any type of brain imaging, because they're more of the neurological. Remember that circuit slide that I had? Mild TBIs usually result in secondary injury, so you can't do brain imaging to really detect those types of. You can't see that there's disconnect in the neural pathways. It's just too cellular. You can do it, I think, when someone dies, you can do a biopsy, because I know they were doing some research on NFL players like that for multiple concussions over a lifetime. But imaging, you won't be able to do it.
But if you're trying to get them to recall their life history of TBI, then at least I would think, and once again, I can't remember your instrument, but I mean, did you do a calendar with them so you know where you could try to figure out to get the best recall about the incident? You can look at, for example, there's some very granted, it's not typically life history. It's like the last 12 months or the last 3 years, but you can look at some of the drug usage instruments that are really quite sophisticated in trying to get people to recall these events. Because in my mind, it would be difficult to recall all these minor TBIs. Also, I think going forward to differentiate, and you touched on this at the end, that the type of brain damage that occurs between a TBI based on an assault and a TBI based on a sport. Because in this day and age, sport injuries, as you said, the focus on concussions in sports has evolved so much that if a young person gets a concussion in the sport, there's all of these policies and regulations now that prevent them from continuing in that sport and having to, pretty much lay low for a period of time. What I'm getting a sense here, this is such normative behavior for them that their behavior doesn't change after that assaultive behavior. And so to me, even with your population here, because you had 30% that were sports injuries, right? It'd be interesting to see if there was a difference in outcomes based between those who had a sports injury and an injury by an assault. Because I would, and I don't know, I'm not a medical doctor, but I would assume it's not just the TBI, that it's the it's what occurs after the brain injury.
Yeah, so it's like 4 to 7 days of movement disruption, starts as a neurotransmitter disruption across the amygdala, and like that is this precious time where you want to calm down, because like following all these edicts about like as you just said, like taking it easy, really reduces your risk of any medium.
So, let me see. Oh, and then finally, this is a very fatalistic population. I mean, especially from your 5 points at the end. And so, once again, if you're thinking about policies or treatment or health education in the facility, I think you still have to first deal with why are they so fatalistic? Because all the education in the world, if you think your days are numbered anyway, or this is normative behavior, then you may not once again have those successes that you anticipate.
In these comments, you can find very useful suggestions for the future research, and you should really take advantage of these suggestions. And now the floor is open to the audience, and you're free to cast your questions. Okay.
Could you go back to the conclusion slide, please? Number 42. Yeah. This occurred to me earlier in your presentation, but I think you really can make a little bit more of what you found than you have. And I would suggest considering revising the third bullet point to read something like non-significant findings in the quantitative analysis, but they were in the expected direction and consistent with all of the qualitative findings. And so, you mentioned small sample size, of course, but you've got consistent findings in virtually every measure and every concept. That's not important for the dissertation, but if you're going to be writing this up for publication, you really can legitimately make more of what you found. And then the second thing, I'm not sure I heard Jeff correctly, but we're talking about calendars, life event calendar. Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. It's been used quite a bit in correctional research. And Brittany Hayes has just written a drafted paper suggesting that it has a lot of use in family violence because there's a history of violent events and sequences and stuff. And if you frame life events calendars correctly, you can get better recall of series events or repeat violence over the course of several months, if not years. So in the future, research is something to think about. And the final thing is, this is just terrific. I have no power to decide or bless you. I congratulate you on doing some research that must have been very difficult in several dimensions. Good job.
I just have a comment. When you were describing some of the anecdotes that you kind of retrieved from your interviews, this idea that everyone's kind of gets prescribed with a mental health, I guess, issue. And I found that very common through when I was, doing social work on American Island at Free Facility. And I remember this one woman who would just take the dump and then pick up her dump and smear it all over the wall. And it was her way of not going into community segregation. And I found that a lot of communities on American Island do exactly that. They will, and the crazy thing is, I can sit down and have normal, I say normal, an everyday conversation like you and I would have, how are you, how's everything? But, once they're out of door, I guess, the programs area, they're just doing crazy things outside of that, and it's just so normalized.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's like an everyday thing at American Island. So when you were, presenting your flag, they didn't find anything that's surprising. Because, as someone who has worked in American Island, that's an everyday normal living or, thing for someone who's working or living. It's not surprising at all. But I guess to some people it could be. Who haven't ever been on American Island, who never stepped foot in, have never been, have never done anything at work.
And I thought about that too, how so people who, even us, who are Rikers, or I was Rikers, but not anymore, on an ongoing basis, it even becomes kind of normal to you. You're like, oh, that guy just hung it up, or just told me about hanging it up, where someone else might be like, oh my God, that guy just, it becomes kind of normal to us too, because we know it's happening, but it's just like, that's their life, and that's the way that they're perceiving everything around them. It's just ongoing violence.
Question?
Those are good friends. Those are good friends.
Okay, so I'll invite you
Show.
Cassandra, what will we do?
I'm a CC.
No, what will we do?